We thank John Prescott for the offertory. Good morning. My name is Eva Riebold, and I use she, her pronouns. While looking at the Soul Matters material for February, I latched onto a quotation from Black Elk, with whom I have felt a personal connection. This message, I hope, will help widen our circle of understanding of one of our sources of wisdom, the Native American, depicted in our sanctuary on the banner with the great circle with 4 quarters. I have tried to limit my use of the word American Indian. However, I understand that some Native peoples of today call themselves Indian, others not. I hope to put the words American Indian into more of a historical context and use other words to describe the original peoples of this continent. There is so much I would like to tell you about Black Elk and his life, and about the history of the Oglala Lakota peoples, and particularly about their great leaders, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse. The Oglala Lakotas are one of many tribes or bands of people who make up what the white man has called the Sioux. Many, many years before, the Sioux had been driven westward by another tribe. Then they discovered the horse that allowed them to expand into a great empire across the northern Great Plains. They were a powerful group of people and celebrated with intense rituals. They traveled great distances in their quest for bison, that creature which sustained them. I would like to tell you the story of Black Elk, holy man of the Oglala Lakota, and John Neihardt, poet laureate of Nebraska. My information comes from the book Black Elk Speaks by John G. Neihardt, and from the book Black Elk, The Life of American Visionary by Joe Jackson. For me personally, this started at an early age. I was fascinated with what we called Indians. In my play, I would try to build teepees and campfires out in the woods of our farm, and induced my brother and friends into my fantasy of playing Indian. I never even considered playing cowboys and Indians. I was genuinely interested in how it would be for me to live their lives. And I remember making an American Indian scrapbook in Mrs. Morrison's 8th grade class. Then as a senior at MU, a friend invited me on a field trip to the farm of one of the instructors. We students arrived at a small farmhouse outside of Columbia, Missouri, and then sat in a large circle around a campfire. A small, old, white-haired man talked to us about Black Elk and read from his book, Black Elk Speaks. I remember the large impression he made on me with his simplicity of being, his unpretentiousness, and the power of his words. I have learned in more recent times that others who attended MU at about that time also encountered John Neihardt, including Betty Ridge, Scoop Perry, and Francie Wolf. It was later in my young adulthood that I really became acquainted with Black Elk Speaks, and found it one of those special books of my generation, along with the Whole Earth Catalog and Scott and Helen Nearing's book on Living the Good Life, Herman Hesse, The Autobiography of a Yogi, and many others. I kept Black Elk Speaks with me all these years, and then a few years ago, I made a dog walking friendship with a young Navajo woman at Lake Springfield. Sadly, she moved away, and I didn't think I would be reading the book again. I gave it to her, hoping she would read it. And now here I am reading it again. So some of the background history and life of Black Elk that I'm sharing with you today comes from the book Black Elk, The Life of an American Visionary by Joe Jackson, and I will be quoting from him from time to time as well. John Neihardt, a well-known poet historian, was researching the era of the ghost dance. This was the last attempt of the tribal movements to resist the US government. He wanted to interview a holy man who could tell him about the spiritual significance of the ghost dance. Now, Neihardt had experience talking with Native Americans. He understood the rhythms of their speech, their long pauses for thought. He was more tolerant and accepting than most white men of that time. In 1930, he traveled to the Pine Ridge Reservation in southwestern South Dakota, now home of the Oglala Lakota people, asking about the old traditions. He was directed to someone the old men, the long hairs, called the preacher. Now, if any of you have driven to the Black Hills and gone through the Pine Ridge Reservation, you recall that it's a poor, dry, dusty, barren, and sad place. Floyd Tavian and I came through some years ago, broken down trailer homes, a grubby McDonald's, lots of wind and lifeless looking people. In Black Elk's day, it was much the same. These people had nothing, had suffered losses of land, of loved ones, of disease, of religion and culture. They were bitter. They had gone through breaches of treaties where more and more land had been taken away. Finally, each family was given a small allotment. Now, if you know the Western cattle grazing lands, many acres are required for one cow to thrive. The Oglala didn't have enough land with which to do anything. When driving on to the south and east into Nebraska, Floyd and I admired the vast rolling grasses of the sandhills with ranches maybe 50 miles apart from each other, white people surviving very well. The beauty of it was hard to take. As we passed through, I remembered that my grandfather, a German immigrant, had been a sod house farmer in the sandhills. He moved to Missouri where farming was easier. In 1931, Neihardt described Pine Ridge in this way, and I quote him, "Where little else but weather ever happened. Little more than the sun and moon and stars going over, and there was little for the old men to do but wait for yesteryear." End quote. So when Neihardt drove up to Black Elk's cabin, it seemed as though Black Elk had been waiting for someone. He was a tall, lean, dark-skinned man, almost blind, about 67 years old. His white hair was cut ear length, and he wore a weathered white man's suit. At this time in his life, Neihardt was a well-known poet historian. He was about 20 years younger than Black Elk, short, but a strong man with a big, expressive voice. He was born in a prairie cabin, had contracted a mysterious illness and almost died, but during which he had a vision, a flying dream. As a young man, his literary interests were encouraged, and at one point he was given a copy of the Hindu Upanishads. For him, visions were as they were for Black Elk, spiritual indications of his path. They found something in each other, both mystics. He asked Black Elk if they could talk about the old ways. He mentioned Crazy Horse, and Black Elk said that he was his second cousin and what a great man he was. Neihardt agreed with him. Before they parted, Black Elk gave Neihardt a necklace which had belonged to his father, who was also named Black Elk and who was also a medicine man. It consisted of a leather star in the center, signifying, quote, "He who sees will be wise," end quote. Dangling from it was a strip of buffalo hide, signifying all things we get from the earth, food and shelter, and an eagle feather, the great mystery. Black Elk said he would tell him about his great vision. It was sacred, but it needed to be passed on. He asked Neihart to come back in the spring when the grasses would be the width of a hand. Neihart went home to Branson, Missouri, and began his preparations. He received a book contract and an advance, about which he wrote to Black Elk. And then he returned some months later to Pine Ridge with his two daughters, one of whom, Hilda, would take down Black Elk's words in shorthand. Black Elk's son, Ben Black Elk, would be their translator. Black Elk did not speak English, and Ben was accomplished at understanding the importance of the words in Black Elk's story. But before Black Elk could begin, he adopted Neihart and his family into his tribe so that he could pass on the sacred information to them. Neihart begins the book, Black Elk Speaks, with Black Elk as a young boy, and he ends it with the aftermath of Wounded Knee. Joe Jackson tells the rest of the story and life of Black Elk in his book. So I will start by reading a paragraph from the beginning of Black Elk Speaks. My friend, I am going to tell you the story of my life as you wish. And if it were only the story of my life, I think I would not tell it. For what is one man that he should make much of his winters, even when they bend him like a heavy snow? So many other men have lived and shall live that story, to be grass upon the hills. It is the story of all life that is holy and is good to tell, and of us two-leggeds sharing in it with the four-leggeds, and the wings of the air and all green things. For these are children of one mother, and their father is one spirit. End quote. Black Elk goes on to tell his life story, and in particular his great vision, which I will summarize. When he was 9 years old, he became very sick, barely conscious, his legs swollen, high fever, and extreme pain. He could not walk or stand. In his vision, Black Elk saw two warriors coming to him from the clouds with spears thrust before them, out of which lightning flowed. He flew with them through great clouds, and there was a magnificent bay horse who spoke, "Behold me." Then there were 48 glorious horses. Black horses were to the west, the land of the thunder beings, with lightning in their manes and thunder in their nostrils. White horses were to the north, flying like blizzards. Red sorrel horses were to the east, with eyes like the morning star. Buckskins were to the south, with horns on their heads. Now I will directly quote from Joe Jackson and his interpretation of the vision. In quotes, he saw before him the entire spectrum of Sioux cosmology. The black horses of the West represented difficulty, evil, and the destructive powers of the storm, but they also stood for the kind of physical and spiritual torment that toughened one. The white horses of the North stood for endurance, physical health, and wisdom. The red horses of the East were the pure light of the dawn, as well as the understanding and peace that comes with it. The yellow horses of the South represented growth, innocence, and the promise of renewed life. All were blessed by the sky above them and the earth below. What Black Elk witnessed was an incarnation of the Sioux medicine wheel, the philosophical framework through which the Sioux understood their world. End quote. The dream went on. Black Elk was taken to the 6 grandfathers who directed all things, the spirits of the West, North, East, South, Earth, and Heaven, the 6 directions. They showed him the tree of life and the 2 roads. I quote Jackson, "The good red road of life coursing north and south, and the black road running east and west of ruin and fear," end quote. The grandfathers gave him the gifts of life, death, birth, curing, peace, and renewal. He was to use these gifts to save the Lakota. Later in Black Elk's life, he would reflect on that experience and say, "Then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round about beneath me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell, and I understood more than I saw, for I was seeing in a sacred manner the shapes of all things in the spirit, and the shape of all shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw that the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that made one circle, wide as daylight and as starlight. And in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy," end quote. Then the messengers took him back, and he saw a boy lying there, and he realized it was himself. He knew that his life would never be the same. For Black Elk, truth was the oneness of all things. Jackson explains, and I quote, "To the Lakota, nature could be neither fully known nor controlled. The best a man could hope was to venerate nature's power, then use it to the best of his abilities. Man could not stand apart from nature, for he was part of it. Though his role was to understand vast forces, he could never realistically seek to dominate them. One dared not stand above and outside nature's sacred hoop, for such a stance was the arrogance of fools. Since one could only exist inside the hoop, one must try to direct the flow of power from within," end quote. The shamans tapped such power, and there were all kinds. Healers, visionaries, medicine men, heyokas or sacred clowns, dancers, and performers. And over his life, Black Elk was initiated into all of them. Joe Jackson tells us that Black Elk's world, where the inner world and the outer world are one, is a common theme in the lives of holy men and mystics all over the world, whether it is the shamans of today or the Essenes of the Dead Sea. Now I will give you a very brief outline of Black Elk's life. At the age of 9, he had the great vision. Gold had already been discovered in Montana, and the railroad had come through, separating the herds of bison. His elders and kinsmen, Red Cloud, Sitting Bull, and Crazy Horse, had become leaders and been engaged with whites in battles where many had been slaughtered. Gold was discovered in the Black Hills, and then the Indian Wars began in earnest. Black Elk participated in the Battle of the Little Bighorn when he was 12. Later, Crazy Horse surrendered and then was killed at Camp Robinson. Sitting Bull and his group went to Canada, then returned 2 years later and surrendered. During these years of terrible times, Black Elk had visions, heard voices, and had feelings of great responsibility for saving his people. He was so troubled that one of his mentors told him that in order to heal himself and his people, he must stage his horse dance. He must recreate his vision. Lakota medicine men communicated through theater, using dance and visual reenactment. He recreated it and became well known and gained power in his community. After the loss of the warrior leaders and the loss of land and the increased power of the Wasichu, the greedy ones, the Oglala Lakotas and other native peoples had no way of supporting themselves. Many had become dependent upon the rations of the Indian agencies. Then in his early 20s, Black Elk learned of the opportunity of performing with the Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. He wanted to learn about the world of the white people. He joined and toured with the show, going to Europe, where he shook hands with Queen Victoria. After returning to Pine Ridge a couple years later, he renewed his traditional spiritual practices. But the Black Robes, the Jesuits, had already moved into the area, making it difficult. The traditional ways of healing, the rites and rituals had become outlawed, but Black Elk continued practicing. In 1889, rumors began on the West Coast and moved eastward about the ghost dance and the Messiah movement. Black Elk became one of the important dancers. Great numbers of different tribes gathered, and then the military moved in, and the fighting turned into the massacre at Wounded Knee, the final surrender. Black Elk continued his traditional practices until the Black Robes made it impossible. He married, one child survived, Ben Black Elk. He converted to Catholicism. His wife died, he married again, and his daughter survived. He became a spiritual leader in the Catholic Church, teaching catechism and preaching in Lakota, and when asked why, he said, "It is for my children." He became well known all over the West. Then later, he began to combine Catholicism with the traditional ways, a kind of turning back. He appeared at Mount Rushmore in pageants in later years. Then in 1950, he died at 87. Nyhart worked out of Branson, Missouri for many years as literary editor with the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. He was also professor of poetry at the University of Nebraska. Then at the age of 68, he was invited to become poet in residence and lecturer at the University of Missouri. He died in 1973 at the age of 92. Black Elk tried many paths to save his people. He was a seeker, At the end, he felt he had failed and was full of grief and guilt, a broken man. He knew he had been given a mission. In the end, the only thing left was to tell his story to the white man who sought him out. They became friends in the mystery of the Spirit. John Neihardt was captivated and then driven to tell the story and was changed by the experience. He felt it was a spiritual gospel. As they spoke with each other, it was as though they were sharing a consciousness. It became his responsibility and most sacred task, and was the book by which he would be most remembered. The book was republished in 1961 at the beginning of the counterculture. And then the book really became well known after Neihardt was interviewed by Dick Cavett in 1971, who called it, in quotes, the greatest book in the history of the American Indian. I quote now Jackson. Neihardt, who was older now than the old holy man when he'd met him 40 years earlier, said he felt himself becoming more Indian as mortality loomed, end quote. The book was translated into many languages. It is taught in classrooms and has inspired study of the Native American religions, and has been called one of the most important spiritual books of the 20th century. Black Elk's words speak to our minds and hearts through the channel, the conduit, the poet, John Neihardt. Both were men of vision, of deep integrity, and together with a single voice have influenced generations to come. In 1931, after Black Elk had finished telling John Neihardt his life story, the two families traveled together to Harney Peak, the scene of his vision. There, Black Elk said, and I quote, "When I look back now from this high hill of my old age, I can still see the butchered women and children lying around and scattered all along the crooked gulch, as plain as when I saw them when I still young. And I can see something else died there in the bloody mud and was buried in the blizzard. A people's dream died there. It was a beautiful dream," end quote. Black Elk believed the sacred hoop was broken and scattered, and yes, it was. However, the vision of one world, one peace, one people in spirit lives on in thanks to two men of vision and integrity. Amen. I have added a postscript. Sometime after the book was published, some controversy arose as to whether John Neihardt was faithful to the words of Black Elk. It is the opinion of Joe Jackson, author of Black Elk, The Life of an American Visionary, which was published in 2016, that researchers have studied the shorthand notes of Hilda Neihardt and the notes of her father, John, and concluded that in a few places, Neihardt added a summary paragraph and commentaries, but that in essence, he remained true to Black Elk. There's also the problem of translation from one language to another, very different kind of language, and also that a translator was used. Additionally, this was a white man telling a Lakota man's story. However, in my opinion, had Neihardt not taken the responsibility and the opportunity to tell Black Elk's story, his vision and his people's history would probably have been lost to the larger culture and to the world. The end. The interlude will be meditation, composed by John Prescott and performed by John and the First UU Choir.